Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Jason Freeman. I work here in author events. And as you saw in the video that just aired, the Free Library is embarking upon an ambitious initiative to modernize our beloved Parkway Central Library. This effort will renovate tens of thousands of square feet for more public use and create new innovative spaces, including the Common, the Business Resource and Innovation Center, and the Field Teen Center. To learn more about the Building Inspiration 21st Century Libraries Initiative and to support these transformative renovations, please visit 21stcenturylibraries.org. We look forward to an exciting future right here in this historic building. Now, obviously, onto our event. You know him as the musician who's sold more than 20 million records around the world for such albums as Play, Hotel, and 18, among others. For his collaborations with too many varied artists to list here, but I'll just do a few. Brian Eno, Public Enemy, Guns N' Roses, many more. And as perhaps the central force who brought electronic music into the mainstream. But you know the skinny, teetotaling Christian vegan kid from Connecticut who lived on next to nothing as he spun his way to success in the late 80s and early 90s New York club scene? Well, that person's name is Moby, and he is here with his new memoir called Porcelain. Publishers Weekly calls it a love letter to that chaotic, dangerous, beautiful era, and that Moby's prose is honest, self-deprecating, and full of mordant wit, and when music is playing, it shines with exhilarating emotion. Interviewing Moby tonight is Wesley Stace, a frequent Free Library guest author and one of our favorite interviewers of writers. He's the author of 4 critically acclaimed novels, including Misfortune, Charles Jesseled, Considered as a Murderer, and Wonder Kid. It's also likely that you might know him by his gunfighter/Dylan album-inspired pen name, John Wesley Harding, who has released a score of folk rock albums, and for his Cabinet of Wonders radio variety show, which has featured a who's who of contemporary musicians, writers, comedians, and other performers. With no more delays, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Moby and Wesley Stace to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Welcome to the Free Library tonight, and welcome to Moby. You're on a book tour. Your book has come out very recently.
I think it came out yesterday.
Congratulations, that's a big deal.
Thank you.
So that means probably no one here has read the book. Has anyone read the book? Well, I won't give away the ending.
I see a hand up in the back.
There was one.
You know, it's funny, though, because...
Must be in the book business.
So I've been doing interviews around the release of the book, and what I find, because the book, there's a level of, like, off-putting honesty at times in a way that I've been told is not normal. And so I'll do interviews, and people are almost a little, like, cautious. You know, there's this subtext to a lot of the interviews I do where they're like, are you okay? Like, is everything okay? Because the book ends in a really kind of low, dark place.
Well, yes, it does. But in fact, the first question I was going to ask you was, you know, the structure of the book is it doesn't really start with your childhood. It starts off with you kind of living in what might be referred to as a squat in Connecticut and making music and being a DJ in a club. And it ends before Play comes out, just before Play comes out. You're listening to the mixes on a drive north. And that, of course, although it's a dark place, it's also a happier place in that we know what happens next for you, which was presumably enjoyable on some level and is why you've had the chance to, you know, why you've got a book out. So I just wanted to ask you first just about that structure of it being up to Play rather than including things after that and starting not really with your childhood.
Well, so before trying to write the book, I went out and read as many music memoirs as I could. Or I should be fair, I downloaded the beginnings of a lot of music memoirs, and a lot of them, I hate to say this, there aren't that many good ones.
No, it's true.
And I wanted them to be good. Like some of them, I had really high hopes for other people. And there's some great ones. Like actually, oddly enough, one of my favorites is Duff McKagan. the bass player from Guns N' Roses, his memoir is delightful. Like, he's this sensitive, thoughtful, sober guy. Like, his memoir is actually way better than some more literary memoirs. So I was sort of thinking, how do you try and condense an entire life into a book? And by definition, you have to give short shrift to almost, is there ever long shrift? Or is shrift just a word that only exists as short shrift? Like, there's never a shrift. Yeah, like, you have to give short shrift to a lot in order to condense a life into a book. Like, it doesn't even matter if you've been a toll booth attendant your entire life. You have to leave stuff out if you're writing an entire life into a book. So then I thought, what discrete chunk of my life could I write about in an ostensibly compelling way? And I came up with this 10-year period from 89 to 99. Because in 1989, I was squatting in an abandoned factory, making around $3,000 or $4,000 a year, and I had no running water, no bathroom. It's my Abe Lincoln story. And then the book, and then in these 10 years, I changed quite a lot, New York changed quite a lot, the music world changed quite a lot. So part of the choice to do this discrete chunk of 10 years was also, I felt like I could write about things that were not me. So that way, if someone didn't like me, they could read the book and still get something out of it. You know, they could, because it's about New York, it's about gentrification, it's about relapsing, it's about bizarre spirituality. So there's like a lot of other stuff in there that isn't necessarily just me.
And of course, although you're telling it in a narratively linear, chronological way, of course there are memories of childhood events that come into, at various times, which made me think it was a clever way to do it, because it's not like the childhood gets ignored. The childhood's there, and, your mother is, obviously things happen in the book, in your family's life that are not altogether happy.
Spoiler alert, she dies.
Yeah, it's a joke I couldn't make.
Yeah. I was having lunch with a friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about parents, and I said, oh yeah, my mother died, and my friend got awkward, and she said something that was accidentally really dark and funny. She said, oh, so she's still dead? Yeah, it's like Fear the Walking Mom.
And so going back even a little bit further than that, what was the idea of, I would like to write a memoir? What was the kind of kickoff for that?
Just straight up narcissism. That's kind of the subtext to, I think, all memoir, is the belief that somehow I have something interesting to say. I still don't know if that's the case. But, so a little bit of narcissism, and also I had a Grandpa Simpson moment about 4 or 5 years ago. I was talking to some young people in New York, and I was telling them stories about what New York had been like in the gritty 80s and the early 90s, and they were hanging on my every word. And one of them said, wow, these stories are great, you should write them down. And I thought, oh, okay, so it's my life and my history, which at times seems kind of banal to me, but then you realize enough time passes and it's not as banal as I thought it. Like, I assumed it's banal because it's me, but writing about New York when it was cheap and crack ravaged and gang ravaged, it's none of those things anymore. And so there was sort of like, I could make a contrast that seemed like it had the potential to be compelling.
Let's talk then. You mentioned the kind of honesty aspect of it. When you start at the beginning of the book, you are giving Bible classes, you're running Bible classes, and you say that the only point of you doing that is to make these rich kids feel very bad about having money.
Yeah.
And there is an element that is partly linked with that you link to your Christianity, or perhaps just your character, of judgmentalism. That's what I mean, in the book. But you're harder on yourself, really, than you are on most people. And you're also quite candid about that you're not very proud of those things in yourself, or you weren't at that time. Is that the kind of honesty that people were referring to, or were they just referring to the sexy bits?
I don't know. I think it's both, perhaps.
I have to say, I thought those early scenes with the Bible Club were fantastic.
Well,
and
thanks.
Really great.
I mean, so basically, and I don't want to give away too much of the book, but hopefully this doesn't ruin it. The first half of the book, I am a sober, serious Christian. The second half of the book, I am neither of those things. To an extreme. So the first half of the book, there's this one moment where I'm convinced that the only way to be a good Christian is to give away everything I have, be homeless, and walk around and minister to the poor. And I beat the shit out of myself because I'm not capable of giving up everything I have, keeping in mind, at the time, I was squatting in an abandoned factory making $3,000 a year. So I didn't have much to give away, but I was still so mad at myself that I couldn't truly live my faith in the way that I thought I should by being this wandering mendicant. So maybe it's that type of honesty, or I think there's also, there's a lot of frailty in the book, which is one of the reasons why it's called Porcelain, because porcelain is white and frail, just like me.
There goes that question.
Yeah. And also because I relapse, and so I do a lot of throwing up, and I tended to throw up in porcelain things. And it's the name of my best known song, so fragile, throwing up, marketing.
What was I going to say about that? I mean, do you think there was an element in the Christianity and in the judging and the harsh standards to which really you've lived your own life in terms of veganism and in terms of, do you think in those days there was an element of massive depression and madness feeding into that? Because it has that slight feeling of, I am a very lonely person and I can't really communicate with anybody. I want to be with somebody, but I can't really keep these people around me. And it feels very lonely, those first segments in the book, as though maybe depression's feeding into that.
Yeah, not much has changed.
I'm trying to keep it light.
Yeah. Yeah.
What would your mum have said about that?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know if I'm capable of speaking for the dead. So I don't know. This is one of the interesting aspects of writing a memoir, especially a memoir that aspires to be honest, is traditionally, and I'm sure you've had this experience as well, like if you go out to talk about a record that you've made, you're talking about this third-party thing. And you have some personal attachment to it, but you're not really talking directly about yourself. But here, I've written about myself and my life as honestly as I can, and so then people ask questions that I don't know the answer to. So actually, and I want to be like a super agreeable interview subject and have a great answer. I don't know. I need to think about that. So this is like a form of public therapy.
Right.
Yeah. Because you're a qualified licensed therapist, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
We will have questions later on tonight, but I want to say that one of the great pleasures of the book for me, and we're going to talk about memoirs generally a little bit in a moment, I hope, but one of the great pleasures of the book to me, and I think people will find this, is the way YouTube makes everything so accessible. So when I hear about you doing Go, when everybody called you Moby Go rather than just Moby, because your single was called Go, and
So when I first started, the first single I had was called Go, and it became a big hit in the UK, but people thought my name was Moby Go.
And you just went with it.
Yeah, so up until about 1999, I'd go to the UK and people were like, oh, Moby Go. I was like, well, it's my name and a song, but yeah. And for a while, people thought that because I was a New York dance artist, they assumed that I must have been very large and African American.
Right.
So it happened a couple of times that I'd get off on an airplane in Ireland or somewhere in the UK to be picked up by a local promoter, and they'd be looking for the large African American DJ. And as much as I have love and respect for large African American DJs, I am neither of those things. So I would sometimes just sit there in the airport waiting as the promoter would walk around looking for someone who was not me.
I'm going to come back to the YouTube thing in a second, but that reminds me, you are an anomaly. You were an anomaly in that field. You were heterosexual. You were, not black. You were many things that scene was not. And you talk about it in the book, but tell us about it now, what that was like being the sober guy in a world where everyone else was messed up.
Well, especially, so in the late 80s, because I grew up playing classical music, and then I played in punk rock bands, and then I was in new wave bands, and then in the mid 80s I discovered hip hop and house music, and I fell in love with both. So then from at 85 on, I spent most of my time going to hip hop clubs, house music clubs, Latino clubs, and I would go to these clubs and I'd be the only white person there. And especially like the gay African American Latino house clubs, I felt so honored to be a part of it. And because it wasn't my world, but somehow I'd been invited in. And then I was able to start DJing at these places, and I would be sober, white, and straight, playing to beautiful African American Latino queens out of their minds on drugs. And I was trying to explain this to a friend of mine, that one of the things that made it so powerful was that our cisgender, I just learned that word, you know what it means? Yep. Okay, I just learned it. I was trying to show off.
Okay. Does everybody know what that means?
It's the gender with which you were born. The opposite of trans.
Transgender people refer to people who don't have problems with their gender. Yeah. It's a very au courant word.
Yeah.
That's French.
So my culture to me and music to me when I was growing up were very, very important. But there was an elective quality to it, because we were white growing up in a white world, and we were straight growing up in a straight world. When I had entree to African American, Latino, gay culture in the late 80s, this is when their culture was being ravaged by AIDS, and there was discrimination everywhere. So their nightclubs were not elective. They were necessary. This was like, they were these little refuges of survival. And the fact that I was allowed to be a part of it felt like such an honor. So there's this one chapter where I went to Zanzibar, this club.
The Jersey Club.
Yeah, this club.
That's a fantastic scene in the book.
So I go to this gay house music club in Newark called Zanzibar in 1989 or 1990, and I walk in, and this beautiful queen looks at me and says, "Oh, is it clan night tonight?" And I was like, no, I understand. I'm sorry. I apologize for my race and gender. I'm sorry. And then I got spit on a few times. Yeah. But I didn't care, because I was there. I was able to be a part of this culture that I knew it was so magical. And there was such a, like, for example, in the late 80s, when white people would go to an REM concert and cheer, it was a nice cheer. It was a very pleasant cheer, you know, a very liberal arts cheer. But then when you would go to a gay Latino African American house club, the cheers that you heard were just qualitatively different. It was a cheer of life and celebration and pain and beauty, and it was really remarkable.
You went to the Jersey Club as a dancer rather than a DJ. Yeah. This is a funny question, but were those dance hall owners, as it were, disco bosses, were they impressed by your sobriety? And did it mean you could work better and more efficiently, or did it make no difference to anybody whatsoever?
That's a good question. I don't think anyone noticed.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Or maybe they did, because for example, I worked at this club called Mars. That was where I got my start in New York in '89. And Mars was the most remarkable nightclub. It was 5 or 6 levels in the meatpacking district. And there was hip hop and house music and reggae and all these different types of music. And the DJ booker was out of his mind on drugs constantly. So I just think everyone worked under the assumption that everyone was high and drunk all the time. So I think they just looked at me and wondered what drug was he on.
Right.
Like that made him quiet. You know, it's like,
So let's talk about, I was going to go back to the YouTube thing. One of the chief joys of the book is being able to read the book and read about Go, Moby Go, the wood tick mix?
Wood tick mix.
And just go on YouTube and listen to it while you're reading that passage of the book. And then you talk about the rainforest mix or something. And then you're onto another song. And then you're talking about some Frankie Bones song I've never heard of in my life. And of course, it's just all there to listen to. And one of the things I liked about the book is it's very difficult in a rock memoir, any memoir, to explain putting a piece of music together, but you do it, and you do it very efficiently. Were you interested to be able to communicate those things particularly, or did you just think it was part of the book and you had to do it, and did you consider how to do it? Because it's so difficult to do.
Well, my book editor, when I was writing the book, asked me to write some chapters about making music, and my assumption was, oh, who would want to read that? Like, that's what I do. It's like making sausages. Like, no one wants to know how you make a sausage, or a vegan sausage in my case. And he said, no, I think people would be interested to know how music is made, especially because the way in which I make music is idiosyncratic and unconventional. So I wrote these chapters about trying to write pieces of music, and I wanted to get detailed enough without it just being nerdy lists of equipment, you know? And so it's trying to like focus on there's a technical part, but there's the emotional side of creating something and being present at the birth of creation. Not all creation, but the creation of a song. And how, as musicians, like, first and foremost, we have to make music that affects us. You know, you can't ask someone else to have an emotional reaction to a piece of music if you, as the musician, aren't having an emotional reaction to it. You know, and so I focused on pieces of music that when I was making them, I had that intense emotional reaction to while they were coming together.
In the book, that's a lovely answer. In the book, your memory, like we're talking about Duff's book, or you might talk about many rock memoirs, and I'm here to suggest that a lot of them are not written by those people. You decided not to have a ghostwriter or even a with writer, but you did it yourself, and you have this famous literary ancestor, Herman Melville. What exact relation is he, by the way?
According to my parents, and keeping in mind my parents lied to me a lot.
A lot.
Herman Melville was my great-great-great-granduncle, which is why my legal name is Richard Melville Hall, and my nickname that I've had since birth is Moby.
You were always Moby as a kid?
Since I was 10 minutes old, yeah.
Right. So your recall, I mean, this I'm technically interested in, but I think everybody would be. Your recall is amazing. I mean, you can remember when you walk into a disco, like the first songs that the DJ played. You can remember, lengthy conversations. Now, obviously, you're projecting a little bit of that in the most honest way you can. But what I want to know is, did you keep journals and diaries, and did you refer to them, or how did you make yourself, or get yourself into a state to remember things so vividly? And do you just have a good memory?
I think I have an okay memory. Also, I wasn't too hard on myself in terms of veracity. Like, I wasn't thinking that it had to be 100% accurate. So if I didn't remember something exactly as it happened, that's okay. And also what I found, and I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't make me sound like a pretentious grad student, but there's like a sort of mnemonic contextualization that can happen, where you take a scene and you start to populate it. You know, like you take a living room and you put a futon in the living room. You're like, okay, so who's sitting on the futon? Then you imagine two of your friends sitting on the futon, and the rest of the scene just populates itself. And all of a sudden you can see the refrigerator, you can see the soy milk in the refrigerator, you can see, the rat droppings on the floor, you can see the old Super Nintendo over there. Like, all of a sudden everything else just kind of synaptically, it's like you start this one domino thing, and the dominoes in your brain just start falling. And so that's largely where the population of memory came from. Just this, that's the only mnemonic contextualization is the only way I can think of it.
And diaries and journals, or not?
No. I mean, I have diaries and journals, but they're mainly just me writing like, I'm so sad.
Right, yeah.
know.
No, they're not talking about the great game of Nintendo you just had.
No, I didn't mention Super Mario Brothers.
There's a lot of video games in the book, actually, aren't there?
There's a lot of Super Mario Brothers because we were very poor and we only had one game.
Right.
Again, my Abe Lincoln thing.
In the book, another thing that I was interested in so many things, I have to say, and I mean, I've read a lot of rock memoirs, and it's definitely, I think, one of the best I've read. And I say that quite honestly, and it's right up there, I think, with the Ian Hunter one, which is fantastic. And we all know that being successful in music involves not only making good music and some decent business decisions, but also a lot of luck of being in the right place with the right people. You can't, and even if that happens, you might not be the person who can handle that kind of thing, because that's a unique thing too. You really paint yourself in the book. Not paint yourself, but the stories you tell are like, oh, well, we just happened to, get this rehearsal space and everybody famous in the world, like Sonic Youth was in there, and everybody in the world was in that rehearsal space. But it was just dumb luck that you got it. And whether it helped you or not, I don't know, but it made you feel at the heart of something. And getting the job as the DJ, where, tell that story. You come to New York with...
Yeah, so in 1989, I was living in an abandoned factory, squatting in this abandoned factory in a crack neighborhood, and my then girlfriend, and I still don't know how I managed to have a girlfriend at that time, because I was only bathing like once every 10 days. Like, I didn't have running water. Ugh, I was disgusting. She heard about this nightclub opening called Mars, and she said, oh, there's this nightclub opening called Mars. Go give them a DJ tape, and maybe you can get a job. And so I put on my best nightclub clothes, which was like a black turtleneck and a black jacket that I'd bought at a Salvation Army. And the way I used to get into the city from Connecticut was I would hide in the bathroom of Metro North, because that way you didn't have to pay the fare. And I would jump turnstiles, so you could get in and out of the city completely for free. And I got to the West Side Highway, and I stood in line with all the people trying to get like busboy jobs, and I get to the front of the line, and I say to the HR person, I'm like, I'd like to apply for a DJ job. And they just laughed at me. And they're like, you don't apply for it. No one applies for a DJ job. Like, the way the DJs are hired at the coolest nightclub in the world, is you have to already be a DJ. You don't just apply. But I left them this tape. It had hip hop on one side and house music on the other side. And I was like, that clearly didn't work out. But then the DJ booker also didn't know that you weren't supposed to apply for DJ jobs. And so I was the only person who dropped off a tape. And so it was the only tape he listened to. And he called me that night because he was Japanese and he'd just come to New York and he had been hired as the DJ booker. And that's how I got my first job.
Fantastic. And there's a number of stories like that, where you're very frank about how you fell into the right thing at the right time and in fact fell into the wrong thing at the wrong time also. I'm managed by a man called Barry Taylor, who you were managed by. Yeah. And he comes out of the book fantastically well because he's at Glastonbury. It's pouring with rain. You're having a very miserable time, and you say, I'm going to make because the story with you is your first album, Go, was then your career trajectory was rather spoilt by your second album. Is that right?
Well,
I mean, I've read a whole book about it.
I put out a bunch of singles in the early 90s that did well in the rave scene.
Yeah.
And then in 1995, I put out this very strange record called Everything Is Wrong.
Right.
And it was Spin's album of the year, and it had this European hit single called Feeling So Real. And then electronic music was about to become huge. The Prodigy and the Chemical Brothers and Fatboy Slim and all these people were like poised to sell millions of records, and they did.
And they did.
And I was the face of techno. So my managers, Barry and Marcy and Eric, were super excited. They're like, we have the face of techno. We're gonna get rich. All he has to do is make a techno record. And so I did the smartest thing anyone's ever done. I made a very dark, unlistenable punk rock record.
Right.
That alienated everybody.
And those are quite painful scenes in the book, that tour you went on.
Yeah, it was great. I did this long tour, and we played in Paris at this club that held a couple of hundred people. We sold maybe 60 tickets, and by the end of the show, I think there were 20 people there. So it was grim. And then we were playing Glastonbury in 97 or thereabouts, and it was miserable. Glastonbury, when it's nice, is great, but this was pouring rain, a foot of mud everywhere, just disgusting. People were getting diseases trench foot that hadn't been seen since the Civil War or World War I. And I had this idea, and I was talking to Barry, and I said, Barry, I have this idea. For my next record, I want to make an even harder speed metal record. And he very politely, because he's a very mild-mannered man, he looked at me and he said, yeah, so, you're good at doing punk rock, but, people really like your electronic music. And suddenly it dawned on me, I was like, oh, if I can make music that will deliver emotion to someone, maybe I should do that. And so that's what led to making the album Play.
Which is kind of getting towards the end of the book, yeah, because I think what he says in the book is that's how you make people happy. When you make electronic music, you make people so happy. And then Play, finally, well, it's after the end of the book, but that is a very, beautiful, that does make people very happy play, doesn't it?
It seemed, yeah, I mean, it's weird because when it came out, it was a failure. So at the end of the book, when I'm finishing making this record Play, my career is basically done. Like, I've lost my record deal, I'm broke, I'm an alcoholic, I'm battling panic attacks, my mom has just died, everything is terrible. And so I finished the album Play and the book ends. I just gave it away, sorry.
But
there's another reason to read the book, My Brief Career as a Professional Dominatrix. You think I'm kidding?
That's the headline. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to move the questions to you guys. So if you've got anything to ask, I'll just wrap it up quickly here. And I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask you now. I just had such a nice one.
Does it have to do with hair loss?
No, not at all. I wasn't going to bring. You told me not to mention that. Yes, well, I was going to ask this one question, which was. The book is it's a book of a well-read, educated person.
Go on.
Which didn't surprise me. But it surprised me in the book that you don't really talk about your education at all. Like, you talk about a misspent youth and a youth in poverty, basically. And then we get that in kind of flashbacks. And then we get your kind of post-university period, because you're living in a squat and dating somebody at university. But we never really hear in the book, and I wondered if you could just speak for a couple of minutes about how you got to know the things you do and the references you do, because I know you are
Part of it was growing up. My mom was a literature major, and everyone in my family, like, we had a subscription to the New Yorker for as long as I can remember. And I grew up having very little to do on summer vacation, so I would just go through my mom's books and read the ones with cool titles. And that oftentimes meant like Faulkner, because Faulkner has great titles, like As I Lay Dying and Intruder in the Dust. And then she loved Charles Bukowski, so I'd read Charles Bukowski, or like Rimbaud, Season in Hell. I was like 12 years old, I was like, I want to read a book called Season in Hell. And also, I was not very good at sports, and I was not overly troubled with the attention of the opposite sex, so I had a lot of free time. And so I read just kept reading. And then when I was at college, I studied philosophy, but I never quite graduated. Like, I kept going back, and I studied photography, filmmaking, but mainly philosophy, and got like within an inch of graduating, but just sort of forgot to graduate.
Where were you at college?
I went to University of Connecticut and then State University of New York at Purchase.
What is it, sir?
You said you alienated people with your punk album. So if you have like your band, how do you share your vision with those people or people you want to collaborate with, even if it seems like an unpopular thing to do?
With a band?
Yeah.
I mean, for the most part, most of the records I've made have just been me by myself. So when I toured, I would hire musicians, and largely, and this is maybe some function or dysfunction of my like weird attachment issues, but I would like hire friends to play music with me and then play what I tell them to play. So clearly that's the product of like an only child who lives by himself. So there was not a lot of collaboration. I mean, I love, and I'm envious of bands and people who actually make music in a gregarious way, and are collaborating, because it seems like it'd be so much fun. But generally, I've just tended to make music a little more aesthetically and a little more monastically.
Philosophy is about questioning. Can you talk about what role it played in your life? Did you find the answers you were looking for?
That's a great question. I'm going to try and not answer it in 75 minutes. Yeah, I mean, I was raised, my mom was very interested in like different spiritual pursuits. So she was interested in Taoism and Krishnamurti and Christianity and all sorts of different things. And to me, it seems like one of the most self-evident questions, or one of the most obvious functions of the human condition, is asking what is going on. You know, I guess in philosophy that would be epistemology, or like, you know, the study of what can be known. And then the questions become, okay, what can be known, and who's knowing it, and what am I capable of knowing? And these are really interesting questions. You know, like what exists out there, what exists in here, what's the relationship between the two? And philosophy is one good way of looking at it. Spirituality is a very interesting way of looking at it. Lately, science, you know, especially the last 100 years of physics has been a really interesting way of looking at it. So I fully accept that I don't think there's any way to ever know. You know, that's the sort of like Descartes on dilemma of we can't know anything objectively, but it's really interesting to try. And to also look at what the human condition is in the face of the grand and unknowable, you know, and why we have reactions to certain things. So, and philosophy is a really fun, interesting part of that process.
There's a bit in the book where you're looking at the ants, and the ants are telling you lessons about life, you know.
Generally, if someone's writing about ants communicating with them.
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot about sex in the book, but there's not necessarily so. Was there ever any drug taking at all in the beery years?
Not much. I took mushrooms once, and I loved them. And I learned things about the nature of the universe while on mushrooms, but that was just one time. I feel like existence is sort of psychedelic enough. Like psychedelic drugs don't really add anything. If anything, they sort of like take away our sort of rigid compartment. And I've only taken psychedelic drugs once or twice, so I'm a novice, and now I'm sober, so I'll never take them again. But the nuance and complexity of existence is clearly there. I think psychedelic drugs and some experiences just enable people to get a glimpse of just how nuanced and complicated things really are. You know, like it's really our cognition just in a very self-protecting way takes the unspeakably complicated and makes it simple. You know, we look at a tree and we're like, yeah, there's a tree. Well, actually, no. There's a trillion upon a trillion cells, each one differentiated and working in perfect harmony with everything else in unspeakably complicated ways. And then you go deeper and deeper into the quanta with which the cells are comprised, and we can't even understand whether it's a particle or a wave or what's going on there. But we look at it and we're like, it's a tree. You know.
And yeah, because when you're looking at the ants, you're having a deep and heavy thought about it, such as somebody on acid might be having at that particular moment.
Yeah, maybe I just have an excess of DMT floating around my brain.
That's what I'm
I don't
suggesting.
know. Yeah.
Did you read Pete Townshend's memoir? And along those lines, I was surprised in his by how, given his success, he was very not confident in himself. And did you make yourself a little more than maybe your real self?
I started reading Pete Townshend's memoir, and I need to go back and actually finish it. So I mean, but insecurity, it's that balance. I think that a lot of quasi-public figures or public figures or people who feel the need to like put themselves out in the world to be evaluated and, you know, hopefully loved and judged, it has to be motivated by some degree of insecurity. You know, my friends who are like sane and rational and normal and well-adjusted don't feel the need to take their deepest, darkest self and secrets and put them out in the world for other people to experience. So like, there's clearly a lot of dysfunction behind everything I do, and a lot of insecurity as well. They're sort of by definition has to be. And oftentimes I think that arrogance is just really insecurity trying to put on a brave face.
Go ahead.
But then again, some people are just sociopaths who are arrogant, so.
Hi, I'm nervous, so I'll make this quick. I plan on reading this weekend, but I did want to ask you about play and how that came to be, and if you are happy with it, or if you were happy with it, you know, when you were developing it, because it is one of the most beautiful things from start to finish that I've ever heard.
Oh, thanks. Basically, I thought my career had ended, because largely it had, and I was going to make this one last record. And so I made it in my bedroom on really cheap equipment, and as a result, I thought it was going to be not even a failure, because I think for something to fail, people have to be aware of it. So I assumed it was just going to be this obscure record that was going to be released and no one was going to pay attention to it, because it was 1999, the era of Limp Bizkit and the Backstreet Boys. And that's what I felt like I was competing with. And I made this lo-fi, cheap record involving 50-year-old gospel samples, which was not exactly a recipe for success in 1999. So I think if play is special, one of the things that made it special was I really didn't think anyone was ever going to pay attention to it. So just making it for the sake of making it and hoping that maybe a few people would pay attention to it. Like there's something liberating about laboring in obscurity.
First off, it's truly an honor to meet you or to speak with you. My question is, over time, I feel that you spoke for a generation of a lot of people when you would articulate your love for the teachings of Christ, while at the same time being able to like chastise religions for not being accepting of others and being judgmental, while at the same time acknowledging your ups and downs over the years that I've read through various interviews. With our changing country now, acceptance of different lifestyles, of equality movements, marriage equality, things like that, as well as moves towards liberalism and increased conservatism at the same time. Right now, I just was kind of curious of where you are now in your faith and how you feel things are progressing or not progressing in our country.
That's such a good question. Boy, oh boy. Okay, my personal faith is like, I now self-identify as a Taoist, quantum mechanics loving, Sufi, aspiring Jew, lover of Christ, etc. Because I feel like in a universe that's potentially 15 billion years old, vast beyond our imagining, and possessed of dimensions that we can't even conceive of, who would I be to say that I can tell you who the architect of the universe is? You know, like in the book I talk about, I don't even know where my fingernail comes from. So if I don't know where my fingernail comes from, how can I say something about a God who created a 15 billion year old universe? So there's that, like in AA, I've outed myself as a member of AA, don't be mad. The third step says, turned our life and our will over to the care of God as we understood God. And I wrestled with this because my life and my will is ostensibly all that I have. And who is this God that I'm turning it over to? To the God of my understanding. And finally I accepted, oh, the God of my understanding is a God that I don't understand. And so life is this process of trying to have some sort of relationship with whatever has led us to be, you know, and trying to better understand what that force might be and what it has in mind for us. I like to work under the assumption that that force also created puppies. So a life force that creates puppies clearly can't be judgmental and mean. You know, like no mean, stern, judgmental God makes puppies. It's just like, it's just impossible. Like Ted Cruz's God does not make puppies, you know? And as far as like our country, I'm gonna make some broad, general, grand statements, is we're basically all operating in like this like semiotic ignorance. What I mean is we're responding, we're giving things meaning that have proven themselves to not have meaning. Like we collectively think that like everything's symbolic. You know, we think, oh, if I have this level of wealth, I'll be happy. But the people who have that level of wealth are miserable. You know, like if I have those things, I'll be happy. No, the people who have those things are miserable. Oh, if I'm famous, I'll be happy. No, the people who are famous are either killing themselves or dying slow deaths of sadness and mediocrity. You know, like, but we still buy into these tropes. We still buy into the power of these symbols, even though there's no evidence to support the idea that these symbols have any value. You know, and so I think the only thing that's left for us, unless we just die because of climate change, is actually like, hopefully at some point, having like a rational, empirical idea of who we actually are and why we're doing the things that we're doing. I don't see much evidence to indicate that we're really moving in that direction. You know, I see Bernie and Donald Trump screaming at the top of their lungs. I'm like, I don't know how much like progress and reason is evidenced there. And I love a lot of what Bernie says. I just wish he would stop screaming so much. It scares me.
Hi, Moby. I'm Paola. We've seen you create a lot of stuff, you know, amazing career, and now you're an author. I'm just curious as to what's on the horizon for you. Do you have any plans on creating more music?
I have a simple goal. I would like to be the first democratically elected dictator of the entire planet. So I'm working on that. And apart from that, one of my goals in life is to not have a career. Like, career makes me really sad. Because when you have a career, you start making decisions to protect and advance your career. And almost always that involves sacrificing integrity and creativity. And I'm sure I've been guilty of that as well. But I don't want to do that. Like, I want to make music because I love making music. I don't want to make music because it helps my personal brand development. You know, so if I do things, I just want to do them for the love of doing the thing and the idea that somehow it might be of service. I don't want to do it just to like protect my ego and self. So that's one of my hopes. How that manifests itself, I have no idea. But it's also, I mean, presumptuously, I think the world needs help, and I just want to be available to offering some help if I can. I don't know how.
Do you actually have some music in the works at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, as a 50-year-old man who hates touring, and it's 2016 and no one buys records.
Snap.
I feel a little, yes, I'm putting out a new record in September.
Great.
Don't worry, I don't expect anyone to listen to it. You know, and if you do, great. By all means, don't buy it, because who would buy music in 2016? But like, I was talking to a friend of mine, she said, oh, you're putting out a new record. And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna put it out in like all the relevant formats, like wax cylinder, 8-track. You know, like, I love making records. I can't pretend that people are gonna pay that much attention to it.
Hi, I'm really happy that you're here, and I'm really happy that I'm here. I'm a friend of Bill's as well, and I just wanted to say that I love how you said that you were just dancing and a part of that scene, and people couldn't tell the difference, like they weren't sure if you were on drugs or not. And I love that because I feel that way about myself. And I just wanted to know how being sober and being famous has, like, how has that been? I'm just curious.
I mean, it's been interesting because I've been sober many times. I first got sober when I was 13 years old because I started doing drugs when I was 10, which might explain the getting messages from ants on the sidewalk.
Right, yes, that's true, that's true.
So October 18th, 2008 is my for real sober date. And basically the biggest consequence, or the biggest way in which sobriety has affected career or work is I don't worry as much, and I'm not as controlling, and I'm not as afraid. Meaning, I used to want to make a record and make sure that people loved me for it, and make sure that my record label loved me for it, and try and control the process and control the outcome, and now I don't care. Like, I love making things. Like with this book, I loved writing it. If it sells, okay. If it doesn't, that's okay. Like, it's out there, and if someone responds well to it, great. And if no one does, I still just loved making it. So it's almost, especially the spiritual work that goes along with sobriety, or hopefully does, has enabled me to love the work, but not be too concerned with the outcome. You know, because I'm not omniscient, and any effort that I make at controlling things is clearly coming from fear and darkness. So I try just not to control it and just enjoy the process. As cliched as that might sound, but I think it's actually true.
Hi, Moby. One question. When did you decide to become a vegan? I know you're very compassionate toward animals and the various organizations you belong to. What made you go with a vegan lifestyle?
So I've been a vegan now for 28 years. I had one lapse in 1992. I had yogurt. I'm sorry. I'm an apostate. But I became a vegetarian 30 some odd years ago because I had adopted this little kitten named Tucker. And when I adopted Tucker, he was yay big and his eyes hadn't opened yet. And my grandmother's dachshund George nursed Tucker back to health. And Tucker lived to be 23 years old. It's an old, happy cat. He's dead now. But when I was 19, I was petting Tucker. And all of a sudden, it was like going to the synaptic chiropractor, where like stuff aligned. Because up until the time I was 19, I very happily held on to this like Western paradox of loving animals and eating animals. And I'm not judging or criticizing, but I loved animals, but I also went to Burger King. And then I was petting Tucker the cat, and all of a sudden everything lined up, and I said, oh, here's this cat, and he has 2 eyes, and a central nervous system, a rich emotional life, and a profound desire to avoid pain. And suddenly I realized, oh, every animal with 2 eyes and a central nervous system has a rich emotional life and a desire to avoid pain. And at that moment, I simply realized I couldn't be involved in anything that contributed to or caused animal suffering. So that was 30 some odd years ago. And that led me to be a vegan 28 years ago. And really, like, writing books, making music, doing stuff like this, I love it and it's really fun, but this isn't my work. My work is animal activism. You know, like, that's my job. This is fun, you know, but working on behalf of animals, that's my life's work.
Thank you.
So we're going to go upstairs, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, before you all run up to get your book signed, will you please just say once more thank you to Moby for writing the book and for being here with us tonight.
And thanks for talking to me.